January 15th, 1919, Boston. The city was alive with the usual hustle and bustle of a winter day. The streets were filled with people going about their daily routines, unaware of the impending catastrophe. A cold day, but the sun was shining. The crisp air carried the promise of a typical winter day in New England. The sky was clear, and the sun's rays glinted off the icy patches on the ground, creating a picturesque scene. Children played in the streets of the North End, a bustling neighborhood. Their laughter echoed through the narrow alleys as they chased each other, their breath visible in the cold air. The North End was a vibrant community, full of life and energy. The air smelled of salt and fresh bread. Life was ordinary. Street vendors called out their wares, and the aroma of freshly baked bread wafted from the local bakeries. It was a scene of normalcy, a snapshot of everyday life in early 20th century Boston. Then the earth trembled. A low rumble grew louder. At first, it was barely noticeable, a distant sound that could be mistaken for the usual city noise, but it quickly became impossible to ignore. It sounded like a train, but it was coming from everywhere at once. The ground beneath their feet seemed to vibrate, and the noise grew to a deafening roar. People stopped to listen, their hearts pounding. Conversations halted mid-sentence, and all eyes turned towards the source of the sound, though it seemed to come from all directions. What was that terrifying sound? Faces filled with confusion and fear as the rumble continued to grow. It was unlike anything they had ever heard before. No one knew it yet, but a disaster was about to unfold. The ground shook more violently, and the noise reached a crescendo. People began to panic, unsure of what was happening. A disaster unlike any Boston had ever seen. The city had faced its share of challenges, but nothing could have prepared its residents for what was coming. A disaster made of molasses. A massive storage tank filled with over 2 million gallons of molasses had burst, sending a tidal wave of the sticky substance through the streets. Buildings were swept away, and people were caught in the deluge. The Great Molasses Flood of 1919 would go down in history as one of the most bizarre and tragic events the city had ever experienced. The North End was a neighborhood of immigrants. Italians, Irish, and Eastern Europeans lived and worked side by side. They spoke different languages, but they shared a common dream, a better life in America. The streets were narrow, the buildings packed close together. Families lived in tenements, often several to a room. Life was hard, but there was a strong sense of community. In the heart of the North End stood a giant tank. It held molasses, a sweet syrup used in many foods. This tank, however, would soon bring not sweetness, but sorrow. The tank was truly massive. 50 feet tall, it dominated the entire skyline. It held 2.5 million gallons of molasses, used to make rum and industrial alcohol. The United States Industrial Alcohol Company built the tank just a few years earlier. It was a symbol of progress, of America's industrial might and innovation. But the tank had problems. Residents complained, it groaned and creaked ominously. Molasses oozed from its seams, attracting flies and rats constantly. Little did they know a far greater danger lurked within, waiting to be unleashed. Section 4. Whispers of danger. The tank was poorly constructed. It was made of thin steel and its rivets were faulty. People whispered about its safety, but their concerns were ignored. The company dismissed the leaks and noises as normal. They assured everyone the tank was safe. They were more interested in profits than in people's lives. The stage was set for disaster. All it took was a spark, a change in temperature, a slight shift in the earth. And on that cold January day, the unthinkable happened. Section 5. The Wave of Molasses. The tank ruptured. It was a cold January day in 1919 when the unthinkable happened. The massive steel tank filled to the brim with over 2 million gallons of molasses gave way. The sound of the rupture echoed through the narrow streets of Boston's North End, a harbinger of the disaster that was about to unfold. With a deafening roar, a wave of molasses surged through the streets. The sheer force of the explosion sent rivets flying like bullets, and the ground trembled as the thick, dark liquid began its relentless advance. The wave moved with a speed and ferocity that defied belief. a sticky tsunami of destruction that would leave an indelible mark on the city and its people. It moved faster than anyone could have imagined, a sticky tsunami of destruction. The molasses, usually slow and viscous, was propelled by the sheer volume and pressure, reaching speeds of up to 35 miles per hour. It engulfed everything in its path, leaving a trail of devastation that stretched for blocks. The streets, once bustling with life, were now a chaotic river of molasses, carrying debris and destruction in its wake. The wave was 25 feet high. Imagine a wall of dark, sticky liquid towering over you, moving with unstoppable force. It was a sight that defied comprehension, a nightmare come to life. The wave's height and speed made it an unstoppable force, crashing through the neighborhood with a power that seemed almost supernatural. It smashed into buildings, crushing them like toys. Wooden structures splintered and collapsed under the weight of the molasses, while brick buildings fared little better, their walls crumbling as the wave surged forward. The destruction was swift and merciless, leaving behind a landscape of ruin and despair. It swept people off their feet, carrying them away in its sticky grip. Men, women and children were caught in the wave, their screams of terror drowned out by the roar of the molasses. Some were able to cling to debris or find refuge on higher ground. But many were not so fortunate. The molasses, thick and suffocating, made it nearly impossible to escape once caught in its grasp. The air filled with the deafening roar of the collapsing tank, the screams of the terrified and the sickeningly sweet smell of molasses. The scent, usually associated with comfort and warmth, now mingled with the acrid smell of destruction, creating a sensory overload that added to the horror of the scene. The sounds of the disaster were a cacophony of chaos, a symphony of destruction that would haunt the memories of those who survived. The North End was instantly transformed into a scene of chaos and carnage. The once vibrant neighborhood was now a disaster zone, with buildings reduced to rubble and streets choked with molasses. Rescue efforts were hampered by the sticky, treacherous conditions, and the true scale of the disaster would only become apparent in the days and weeks that followed. The Great Molasses Flood, as it would come to be known, left an indelible mark on Boston, a tragic reminder of the fragility of human endeavors in the face of nature's unpredictable fury. Section 6. Chaos and carnage, the molasses engulfed everything in its path. On January 15, 1919, a massive storage tank filled with over 2 million gallons of molasses burst, unleashing a wave of sticky brown syrup that swept through the streets of Boston's North End. The force of the explosion was so powerful that it sent a 15-foot wave of molasses traveling at 35 miles per hour, destroying everything in its wake. People were trapped in their homes, buried alive in the sticky goo. The molasses poured into basements, trapping families inside their own homes. Some tried to escape through windows, only to find themselves stuck in the thick, viscous liquid. The sheer weight of the molasses made it nearly impossible to move, and many were unable to free themselves. Horses and wagons were swept away, their drivers struggling in vain. The molasses was so dense that it lifted entire wagons off the ground, carrying them along with the current. Horses, unable to find footing, were quickly overcome by the syrupy flood. Drivers and passengers alike were thrown into the molasses, their desperate attempts to escape thwarted by the sticky substance. Rescue workers rushed to the scene, but the molasses made their job nearly impossible. Firefighters, police officers and volunteers all converged on the disaster site, but the thick molasses hindered their efforts. They used ladders and ropes to try and pull people to safety, but the molasses clung to everything, making it difficult to get a firm grip. The cold January air caused the molasses to thicken even more, further complicating rescue efforts. It was thick and heavy like quicksand. The molasses had a density that made it almost impossible to wade through. Rescuers described it as trying to walk through wet cement. Every movement was met with resistance, and the more they struggled, the more the molasses seemed to pull them down. Every step was a struggle. People found themselves sinking deeper with each attempt to move. The molasses clung to their clothes and skin, weighing them down. Some rescuers had to be rescued themselves after becoming stuck in the molasses. The scene was chaotic, with shouts and cries for help echoing through the streets. The smell of molasses, once sweet and inviting, now hung heavy in the air, a sickening reminder of the destruction. The once pleasant aroma had turned into a nauseating stench that permeated the entire neighborhood. The molasses coated everything it touched, leaving a sticky residue that was nearly impossible to clean. The cleanup efforts would take months, and the smell would linger for even longer. The North End, once a bustling neighborhood, was now a scene of unimaginable horror. Buildings were reduced to rubble, and the streets were filled with debris. The molasses had seeped into every crack and crevice, leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. The community was left to pick up the pieces and rebuild, but the memory of the disaster would haunt them for years to come. The Great Molasses Flood remains one of the most bizarre and tragic events in Boston's history, a testament to the destructive power of an everyday substance. Section 7. The Aftermath. The flood subsided, leaving behind a scene of utter devastation. Buildings were reduced to rubble. The streets were covered in molasses, littered with debris and the bodies of the dead. The official death toll was 21, but the true number may have been